I never thought I'd be the kind of man to hear whispers in the dark, but that's how it started, shadows talking louder than words. It was a Tuesday night, the kind where the air hangs heavy with nothing to say, when I came home early from work and saw their silhouettes through the kitchen window. My wife, Clara, and my stepfather, Roy, pressed close together like two pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed. I froze, my keys biting into my palm, and watched as the shadow of her hand brushed his arm, lingering too long to be innocent. That moment carved itself into me, a jagged little hook I couldn't pull out. My name's Daniel, and I'm not the hero of this story, maybe not even the villain. I'm just the guy who thought he had a life worth living until the two people I trusted most turned it into a house of cards. Clara and I had been married 7 years, the kind of stretch where you stop counting the days and start counting the silences. Roy, well, he'd been around since I was 12, stepping in after my real dad walked out. He wasn't perfect, gruff, stubborn, with a laugh that could rattle the windows, but he was family. Or so I thought. That night, I didn't barge in. I couldn't. My feet felt like they'd grown roots into the gravel driveway, and my chest tightened like someone had wound a clock too far. Instead, I slipped back to my truck, drove around for an hour, and let the hum of the engine drown out the questions clawing at my skull. Why? How long? Was it my fault? By the time I pulled back into the drive, Roy's old Chevy was gone, and Clara was in the kitchen, humming like nothing had happened, stirring a pot of chili like it was any other Tuesday. Early night? She asked, not looking up. Her voice was smooth, too smooth, like she'd rehearsed it. Yeah, I said, my throat dry as sandpaper. Slow day. She nodded, and I watched her, really watched her, for the first time in months. The way her dark hair curled at the nape of her neck, the faint lines around her eyes that I used to trace with my thumb. She was beautiful, always had been, but now I wondered who she was beautiful for. I didn't ask about Roy. I didn't say a word. I just sat at the table, spooning chili into my mouth, tasting nothing but ash. That was the beginning, the first crack in the dam. I didn't know then how deep the water would get, how it'd pull me under and spit me out somewhere I'd never recognize. But I knew enough to start listening, to start watching. The shadows had spoken, and I couldn't unhear them. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Clara singing softly in the kitchen. It was an old song, one her mother used to hum when we were kids sneaking into her backyard to steal apples. Hearing it now twisted something in my gut, a memory I didn't want tainted. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many lies could fit into a melody. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I started digging, quiet-like, the way a man might poke at a bruise to see how bad it hurts. I called in sick to work, something I hadn't done in years, and waited until Clara left for her shift at the diner. She kissed my forehead before she went, her lips cool and quick, and I forced a smile that felt like it might crack my face in two. The second her car rattled out of the drive, I was up, moving through the house like a ghost. First stop, her phone. She'd left it charging on the counter, a careless habit I'd always nagged her about. I punched in her passcode, our anniversary, 0928, and scrolled through her texts. Nothing obvious at first. A thread with her sister about a cousin's wedding, a few memes from a coworker. Then I saw it, Roy, with a single message from 2 days ago. Thursday, usual spot. Don't be late. No reply from her, just that. My pulse thumped in my ears. Thursday was tomorrow. I set the phone down exact as I'd found it and moved to the bedroom. Her side of the closet was a mess, dresses tangled with scarves, shoes spilling out like secrets. I rifled through pockets, pulled out drawers, looking for anything, a note, a receipt, a sign. Nothing. Just the faint smell of her lavender perfume clinging to everything. I was about to give up when I saw the jewelry box on her dresser, the one Roy had given her for our 5th anniversary. Mahogany, carved with little roses. I'd always thought it was a strange gift, too personal, but she loved it. I lifted the lid. Inside were her usual trinkets, earrings, a silver chain, that cameo brooch from her grandma. But underneath, tucked into the velvet lining, was a folded scrap of paper. My hand shook as I opened it. In Roy's blocky handwriting, "You're still my best-kept secret." No date, no context, just those 6 words staring up at me like a confession. I sat on the edge of the bed, the note burning a hole in my palm. My stepfather. My wife. The two of them, tangled up in something I couldn't unsee. I wanted to scream, to smash the box against the wall, but I didn't. I folded the note back up, slipped it into my pocket, and put everything back the way it was. If they were playing a game, I'd play too. But I'd play smarter. Tomorrow was Thursday. The usual spot. I didn't know where it was yet, but I'd find out. I'd follow the shadows until they led me to the truth, or to something worse. Thursday morning hit me like a freight train I couldn't dodge. I barely slept, the note in my pocket feeling like a live wire every time I shifted in bed. Clara was up before dawn, her routine unchanged: coffee, toast, a quick "love you" tossed over her shoulder as she grabbed her keys. I mumbled it back, watching her silhouette against the sunrise, wondering how many times she'd lied with those same 2 words. I had a plan, rough as it was. Step 1. Follow her. Step 2. Figure out what usual spot meant. Step 3. Well, I hadn't gotten that far. Anger and hurt were steering the wheel, and I was just along for the ride. I waited 10 minutes after her car pulled out, then grabbed my jacket and headed for the truck. The air was crisp, the kind that stings your lungs, and I welcomed it. It kept me sharp. Clara's diner was a 20-minute drive, a greasy spoon on the edge of town called Millie's. I'd been there 100 times, birthdays, late-night pie runs, even our first date. She worked the morning shift, 7 to 3, and I figured she'd head straight there. But usual spot nagged at me. Roy didn't hang out at Millie's, not unless I dragged him there. So where? I parked across the street from the diner, slouched low in the cab, and watched her Ford Tempo roll into the lot. She climbed out, hair tied back, apron slung over her arm, looking every bit the Clara I'd married. She went inside, and for an hour, nothing happened. Customers trickled in: truckers, retirees, the usual crowd. No Roy. No sign of anything off. Then, at 9:15, her car pulled out again. She'd barely been there 2 hours. I frowned, started the engine, and tailed her at a distance. She didn't head home or toward Roy's place on the west side. Instead, she turned north, toward the old county road that wound past the sawmill and into the pines. My gut churned. This wasn't her break-time errand route. The road narrowed, trees closing in, and I hung back farther, praying she wouldn't spot me in her rear view. After 10 minutes, she pulled into a gravel lot by a shuttered gas station, Hank's fuel stop, abandoned since the highway bypass killed it years ago. Roy's Chevy was already there, parked crooked like he'd been in a hurry. My mouth went dry. I cut the engine and coasted to a stop behind a thicket, out of sight. Through the branches, I saw them. Clara stepped out, glanced around, then walked to Roy's truck. He climbed out, all broad shoulders and that familiar swagger, and they stood close, too close. No hug, no kiss, just a quick exchange of words I couldn't hear. Then she handed him something small, a bag maybe, and he slipped it into his jacket. They didn't linger. She was back in her car in under a minute, heading south again. Roy stayed, lighting a cigarette, staring at the trees like he was waiting for something or someone. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. What the hell was this? An affair? A deal? Whatever it was, I was in deeper now, and there was no turning back. I sat there in the truck, engine off, watching Roy's cigarette glow like a tiny ember against the gray morning. The pines swayed in the wind, whispering secrets I couldn't decode, and my mind raced. That bag Clara handed him, it wasn't big, maybe the size of a paperback, but it was heavy with meaning. Lovers don't pass bags in abandoned lots like spies in a bad movie. This was something else, something uglier. I should have driven away, gone home, let the questions fester until I could confront her with cold, hard proof. But the note in my pocket, "You're still my best-kept secret," burned hotter than Roy's cigarette. I needed more. I needed to know what he knew. So I made a choice, reckless and raw. I'd follow him next. He finished his smoke, crushed it under his boot, and climbed back into his Chevy. I waited until his tail lights were pinpricks through the trees, then started my truck and eased onto the road. He headed west, toward his place, a squat little house on the edge of town, surrounded by junked cars and a sagging porch. I'd spent half my teenage years there, fixing engines with him, listening to his stories about the Navy. Now it felt like enemy territory. He didn't go home, though. He turned off before the turnoff to his street, onto a dirt track that led to the old quarry. Nobody went there anymore, not since the company shut it down and left it to the weeds. My headlights caught dust swirling in his wake, and I killed them, relying on the faint outline of his truck to guide me. The quarry loomed ahead, a scarred pit in the earth, and he pulled up near a rusted crane, its arm jutting out like a broken finger. I parked 100 yards back, behind a pile of gravel, and grabbed the flashlight from my glove box. My heart hammered as I slipped out, keeping low. Roy was out of his truck, the bag in one hand, a shovel in the other. A shovel. My stomach dropped. Was he burying something? Evidence? Worse? He trudged toward the quarry's edge, his boots crunching on loose stone, and I crept closer, staying in the shadows. The air smelled of damp earth and diesel, and every snap of a twig under my feet felt like a gunshot. He stopped near a cluster of boulders, set the bag down, and started digging. The scrape of metal on dirt echoed in the stillness, and I crouched behind a slab of rock, peering out. The hole wasn't deep, maybe a foot, before he dropped the bag in and kicked dirt over it. He tamped it down with the shovel, then stood there, hands on his hips, staring at the spot like it was a grave. My mind spun. Drugs? Money? Something worse? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't let it stay buried. He headed back to his truck, and I waited until the rumble of his engine faded before I moved. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I uncovered the bag, a plain canvas sack, tied with twine. I hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside, a stack of photos, a key, and a folded map. I didn't look long, just shoved it all back in and tucked it under my jacket. Whatever this was, I'd figure it out at home. But I just crossed a line, and there was no one crossing it. I drove home with the bag under my seat, its weight pressing on me like a guilty conscience. The road stretched dark and empty, and every flicker of headlights in my rear view made me flinch, half expecting Roy's Chevy to barrel up behind me. I didn't know what I'd taken, not really, but it felt like stealing fire from a dragon's lair, dangerous and alive. Back at the house, I locked the door and drew the blinds before spilling the bag's contents onto the kitchen table. The photos came first, a dozen Polaroids, edges curling with age. My breath caught as I flipped through them. Clara, younger, laughing in a sundress by a lake. Roy, shirtless, grinning with a beer in hand. Me, a gangly kid with a fishing pole, oblivious in the background. These were old, 10, 15 years maybe, but they weren't just memories. In one, Clara's hand rested on Roy's knee, her smile too intimate, his eyes too fixed on her. My chest tightened. This wasn't new. This went back years. The key was next, a small, brass thing with a tag that read, Unit 12. A storage locker? A mailbox? No clue yet. Then the map, hand-drawn on yellowed paper, marked with a red X near the river outside town. No labels, just lines and that X, bold as blood. I sat back, hands trembling, trying to stitch it together. Photos of them together, a key, a map. It wasn't just an affair, it was a history, a plan, something they'd buried to keep hidden. I poured a whiskey, the cheap stuff Clara hated, and let it burn down my throat. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I kept glancing at the clock. She'd be home in an hour, all smiles and lies, and I'd have to look her in the eye knowing what I knew. But what did I know? Not enough. Not yet. The photos gnawed at me most. I spread them out, studying every frame. In one, Roy wore a silver chain I'd never seen before, until I remembered the jewelry box. I bolted to the bedroom, yanked it open, and there it was, the same chain, coiled under her earrings. My stomach lurched. She'd kept it, a trophy or a tether, right under my nose. I was still holding it when I heard tires on gravel. Clara. I shoved the chain back, grabbed the bag's contents, and stashed them in my toolbox in the garage, heart pounding. She walked in as I stepped back into the kitchen, wiping my hands on my jeans like I'd been fixing something. Long day? She asked, dropping her purse on the counter. Her voice was light, but her eyes flicked over me, searching. Yeah, I said, forcing a nod. Tinkering in the garage. She smiled, thin and quick, and started pulling leftovers from the fridge. I watched her move, graceful as ever, and wondered how long she'd been playing me. The photos burned in my mind, her and Roy, a past I'd never seen coming. I couldn't ask her, not yet. I needed the key, the map, the whole damn picture. But sitting there, eating reheated chili across from her, I felt like a stranger in my own life, and the worst was still ahead. Friday morning, I called in sick again. My boss grunted something about not making it a habit, but I barely heard him. The key, Unit 12, rattled in my pocket like a ticking bomb, and the map sat folded in my glove box, its red X pulling me like a magnet. Clara was already gone when I woke up, her side of the bed cold, a note on the counter saying she'd picked up an extra shift. Convenient. I didn't buy it. I started with the key. Storage lockers made sense. Roy had rented one years back for his old Navy gear, some hole-in-the-wall place near the river. The map sex wasn't far from there, maybe a mile up the bank. Too close to be coincidence. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage, just in case, and headed out, the truck's engine growling like it knew what I was up to. The storage place was a sagging row of metal units behind a chain-link fence, rust eating at the edges. A faded sign read, Riverbend Storage, and the office was a trailer with a busted AC unit dripping into the dirt. The guy inside, a grizzled old-timer with a tobacco-stained beard, didn't even look up from his magazine when I asked about Unit 12. 12's paid up, he muttered. Who are you? Checking it for a friend, I said, sliding a 20 across the counter. He pocketed it, shrugged, and waved me off. No questions. Fine by me. Unit 12 was at the far end, its padlock gleaming newer than the rest. The key slid in smooth, clicked, and the door groaned open. Inside, a metal trunk, a folding chair, and a stack of cardboard boxes. Dust hung thick in the air, but the trunk looked used, its latches shiny from handling. I pried it open with the crowbar, the hinges squealing in protest. What I found stopped me cold. Letters, dozens of them, tied with twine, in Clara's looping handwriting. Photos, too, newer than the ones in the bag. Her and Roy at a diner, a motel, a park bench. And a journal, leather-bound, Roy's blocky scrawl filling the pages. I flipped it open, my hands shaking. She's scared he'll find out. One entry read, dated 3 years back. Told her we'd be careful. Worth it. Worth it. The words hit like a punch. I skimmed more, dates, places, promises. They'd been at this since before our 5th anniversary, maybe longer. The letters were worse. Clara's words, soft and desperate, I can't leave him yet. Roy. He'd break. Another, you're the only one who gets me. My vision blurred, rage and grief tangling up inside me. I stuffed a few letters and the journal into my jacket, locked the trunk, and stumbled out into the sunlight. The map was next. Whatever that X marked, it was tied to this, maybe the end of their story, or the start of mine. I drove to the river, parked near the bridge, and hiked upstream, the map trembling in my grip. The X was a clearing, overgrown with briars, and in the center, a rusted metal box half buried in the dirt. I knelt, heart pounding, and dug it free. This was it, the next piece. And I wasn't ready for what I'd find. The river muttered beside me as I pried the rusted box open, my fingers slick with sweat and mud. The hinges fought me, screeching like they didn't want to give up their secrets, but I won. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a knife 6 inches of steel, handle worn smooth, blade stained dark with something that wasn't rust. Next to it, a single photo, creased and faded, of Clara and Roy standing over a man I didn't recognize, sprawled in the dirt. Blood pooled under him, and Clara's face, God, her face was blank, like she'd turned off her soul. I dropped the knife back into the box, my hand shaking so bad I could barely zip the bag shut. The photo stared up at me, and I forced myself to look again. The man was older, gray hair, wearing a flannel shirt torn at the shoulder. Roy's boot rested on his chest, casual as if he'd stepped on a bug. The date on the back, scrawled in marker, August 14th, 12. 13 years ago. I was 19 then, still living with Roy, still thinking Clara was just the girl next door I'd marry someday. My mind reeled, stitching it together. This wasn't just an affair. This was a crime, a murder, maybe, and they'd buried it here, under my feet. The knife, the photo, the map, it was their insurance, their pact. But why keep it? Why risk it? I shoved the box under my arm and staggered back to the truck, the river's whisper turning into a roar in my ears. At home, I locked myself in the garage, spreading everything out on the workbench, the letters, the journal, the photos, the knife. I opened Roy's journal again, flipping to August 2012. There it was, in his clipped handwriting. Had to do it. He knew too much. He handled it better than I thought. Buried the mess by the river. She's tougher than she looks. My stomach twisted. Clara, my Clara, hadn't just watched. She'd helped. I couldn't breathe right. I paced, the knife glinting under the fluorescent light like it was daring me to pick it up. Who was he? Some drifter? A friend? An enemy? The letters offered no names, just panic and promises. We're in this together, Roy. No going back. Together. They built their bond on blood, and I'd been the fool building a life on top of it. Clara would be home soon. I had to decide, confront her, call the cops, or keep digging. The photo of the dead man haunted me, his blank eyes asking why I hadn't seen it sooner. I grabbed the whiskey again, took a long pull, and made a choice. I'd face Roy first. He was the key, the one who'd pulled her into this. I'd go to his place tonight, knife in hand, and get the truth, one way or another. I stuffed the box under the workbench, pocketed the journal, and cleaned up just as her headlights swept the drive. She walked in, tired but smiling, and I nodded like nothing was wrong. Rough day? She asked. You look beat. Yeah, I said, my voice steady as stone. Long one. She didn't know I'd found their grave. But she would soon. I waited until Clara was asleep, her breathing slow and even, before I slipped out. The knife was in my jacket, wrapped in a rag, its weight a cold promise against my chest. Roy's place was a 15-minute drive, and the night stretched black and quiet, the kind of quiet that swallows you whole. I didn't turn on the radio. I wanted the silence, needed it to keep my head clear. His house glowed dimly, a single light in the living room. The Chevy sat crooked in the yard, like always, surrounded by hulks of old cars he'd never fix. I parked a block away, cut the engine, and walked up, the journal in one hand, the knife in my pocket. My boots crunched on gravel, loud enough to wake the dead, or at least the man I was about to face. I didn't knock. The screen door creaked as I pushed it open, and there he was, slumped in his recliner with a beer, TV flickering some late-night rerun. He looked up, eyes narrowing, but he didn't startle. Roy never did. "Danny," he said, voice rough as sandpaper. "Late for a visit." "Shut up," I said, tossing the journal onto the coffee table. It landed with a thud, pages splaying open. "Explain this." He glanced at it, then back at me, slow and deliberate. His face didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, recognition, maybe fear. "Where'd you get that?" "Doesn't matter." "You and Clara. The river. The knife." "I found it all, Roy." "Who was he?" He set the beer down, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't want to go down this road, son. Don't call me that." I pulled the knife out, still wrapped, and dropped it next to the journal. "Start talking, or I take this to the cops." He stared at the bundle, then sighed, heavy and tired. "You're in over your head, Danny. That's what you don't get." "Then make me get it." My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "You and my wife killed someone. Buried him. Kept it like some sick trophy. Why?" He rubbed his face, stubble rasping under his palms. "Wasn't supposed to happen. Guy was a loose end, owed me money, started sniffing around Clara when she was still a kid. Got rough with her one night. I stepped in. Things escalated. Clara helped," I said, the words tasting like bile. "She had to." He came at her again, after I warned him off. She grabbed the knife. Self-defense, but it didn't look that way. We panicked, got rid of him. Nobody missed him. He was a drifter, no family. I laughed, sharp and bitter. "And you two just kept going? Built your little love story on a corpse?" "It wasn't like that," he snapped, standing now, towering over me like when I was a kid. "We didn't plan it. It just happened. After years, it was too late to stop." "Too late." I stepped closer, fist clenched. "You ruined my life, Roy. Hers too. And you're still hiding something. What's the key for?" "Unit 12. His jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought he'd swing. Then he sagged, like the fight drained out of him. "Proof," he said. "More than you've got. Enough to bury us both if it comes out." I nodded, slow. "It's coming out. One way or another." I left Roy's place with the knife and journal in my hands, his words rattling in my skull like loose bolts. "Self-defense," he'd said. "A drifter, no family." Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. But it didn't change the rot at the core. Clara and Roy had built something on that death, something that festered into lies and betrayal. I drove home through the dark, the road blurring as my mind churned. Unit 12 held more proof, enough to bury them, he'd said. I'd get it. But first, I had to face her. Clara was awake when I walked in, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked up, eyes wide, like she'd sensed the storm coming. "Where were you?" she asked, voice soft but edged. "With Roy," I said, dropping the knife, still wrapped, onto the table. The journal followed, its pages fanning out. "Found some things. Want to tell me about August 14th, 2012? Her face went pale, the mug trembling in her hands. "Danny, don't." I cut her off, leaning in. "Don't lie. I know. The river, the box, the knife. The guy you killed. Roy told me everything." She set the mug down, slow, like it might shatter if she moved too fast. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. "He attacked me, Danny. I didn't mean to, I just reacted. Roy helped me clean it up. And then what?" My voice rose, sharp as glass. "You two just kept going? Years of sneaking around, laughing at me behind my back." "No." She stood, tears brimming. "It wasn't about you. It was guilt, at first. Then it turned into something else. I didn't know how to stop. Guilt." I laughed, cold and hollow. "You kept his chain in your jewelry box. Wrote him letters. Met him in secret. That's not guilt, Clara. That's a choice. She flinched, wrapping her arms around herself. I wanted to tell you. So many times. But you'd hate me, and I couldn't lose you. You already did, I said, the words cutting deeper than I'd meant. What's in Unit 12? More lies? More blood. Her eyes darted to the knife, then back to me. It's everything, she said, voice breaking. Photos, recordings, the guy's ID. We kept it in case someone came looking. To protect ourselves. Protect yourselves, I repeated, stepping back. Not me. Never me. Danny, please, she begged, reaching for me. I pulled away, grabbing the key from my pocket. I'm done listening. I'm getting the rest, and then I decide what happens next. She sank into the chair, sobbing, but I couldn't look at her. I walked out, the night swallowing me again. Unit 12 was my last stop, proof to end this, one way or another. I didn't know if I'd turn them in, burn it all, or just walk away. But I knew I couldn't live with half-truths anymore. The truck roared to life, and I headed for the river, the key burning a hole in my hand. The drive to Riverbend storage felt like a funeral march, the key biting into my palm as I gripped the wheel. The night was thick, moonless, and the gravel crunched under my tires like bones. I didn't know what I'd do with whatever I found in Unit 12, hand it to the cops, destroy it, or let it destroy me. All I knew was I needed to see it through, to rip the last bandage off this festering wound. The old-timer was gone, the trailer dark, so I slipped through the gate and beelined for Unit 12. The key turned smooth, the door groaning open like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the trunk sat untouched, but I went straight for the boxes this time. I tore them open, spilling their guts, more photos, a cassette tape labeled 8/14, a wallet with a faded ID, James T. Carver, born 1965. The drifter. His face stared back, hollow-eyed, a ghost I'd never known. The tape was the kicker. I found an old player in Roy's junk pile outside, plugged it in, and hit play. Clara's voice crackled through, young and panicked. He's dead, Roy. What do we do? Roy, calm, cold, we bury him. Nobody'll look. Then the sound of digging, grunts, a sob. It was real, raw, and ugly. Proof they'd never meant for me to find. I sat there, surrounded by their secrets, the knife from the river box in my lap. I could end it all right now, call the sheriff, watch them hauled off in cuffs. Roy's tired confession, Clara's tears, they'd rot for it. Or I could burn it, walk away, let them live with their guilt. My hand shook as I waited, the tape hissing static in the background. Then I thought of the shadows, the ones I'd seen through the kitchen window, the ones that started this. They weren't just Clara and Roy. They were me, too blind, trusting, building a life on sand. I'd been part of this, in my own way, too afraid to see the cracks. That hurt worse than the betrayal. I made my choice. I took the ID, the tape, and a handful of photos, the bare minimum, and left the rest. Back home, Clara was still at the table, eyes red, waiting. I dropped the evidence in front of her. This goes to the cops tomorrow, I said. Tell Roy. You've got one night to figure out your story. Danny, please, she whispered, but I turned away, grabbing a duffel from the closet. I'm done, I said. Not my mess to clean up anymore. I walked out, drove to a motel, and spent the night staring at the ceiling, the shadows gone for good. Morning came, and I called the sheriff from a payphone, anonymous, told him where to look. Then I hit the road, no destination, just away. Clara and Roy would face their reckoning, jail, maybe, or just each other. I didn't care anymore. The truck hummed under me, the horizon wide and empty. I wasn't whole, not yet, but I was free. The shadows couldn't follow where I was going.